Do you even belong here? The officer's voice was sharp, laced with suspicion and disdain. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. He stood by the driver's side window, his hand resting deliberately on his holster, the weight of his authority pressing down like a storm. The man behind the wheel shifted uncomfortably, the leather seat creaking beneath him. His voice was calm but firm, a quiet defiance that refused to buckle under the tension. Yes, officer. I live here. The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning the interior of the car like he was searching for a hidden truth. A luxury sedan parked in a pristine suburban neighborhood didn't fit the picture he'd already painted in his mind. License and registration, the officer barked, not bothering to conceal his skepticism. The man reached for his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate, aware of every unspoken rule that could turn a simple traffic stop into something far worse. Is there a problem, officer? He asked, his tone measured but edged with an understanding of the fragile line he was forced to walk. The officer leaned closer, peering at the license like he expected it to burst into flames. Where'd you get a car like this? He sneered. The air crackled with the unspoken assumption. The man kept his gaze steady, refusing to flinch. I worked for it. The response hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration that the officer's prejudice would not dictate his worth. But prejudice rarely needs permission to act. Step out of the car, the officer ordered, his voice louder now, designed to draw the attention of anyone nearby. A neighbor peeked out from behind lace curtains, their curiosity tinged with complicity. The man hesitated, his mind racing through every protocol, every precaution drilled into him by years of knowing how fragile his existence could be in moments like this. Why? He asked, though he already knew the answer. The officer smirked, as if the question itself was proof of guilt. Step out of the car. The man stepped out, his hands raised slightly to show compliance, even though it tasted like defeat. He stood by the curb as the officer began rifling through the car, tossing papers and belongings onto the pavement without care. A crowd started to gather, their whispers like static electricity in the air. What's going on? Someone murmured, their curiosity quickly drowned by the weight of indifference. The officer found nothing, of course, but that didn't stop him from making a show of the search, pulling out items with exaggerated gestures. What are you hiding? He spat, as if accusing the man was the same as proving his guilt. I'm not hiding anything, the man replied, his voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion of someone who's had to say those words too many times. The officer ignored him, turning instead to his radio, calling for backup. Possible stolen vehicle, he said into the receiver, his words loud enough for the crowd to hear. The humiliation was deliberate, a performance designed to strip away dignity layer by layer. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, their flashing lights painting the scene in harsh red and blue. Another officer approached, his expression mirroring the first, a mixture of superiority and suspicion. What's the situation? He asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. The first officer gestured to the man standing on the curb, his hand still raised slightly, his posture a portrait of forced calm. Doesn't belong here, he said simply, as though that was all the explanation needed. The man's voice cut through the rising murmurs of the crowd. This is my car. This is my neighborhood. I've done nothing wrong. His words were a declaration, a plea, and a warning all at once. But they fell on deaf ears. The second officer approached him, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Turn around, he said, his tone flat, as if the act of arresting an innocent man was just another box to check on his list. The man's shoulders tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. He wanted to fight, to scream, to demand justice, but he knew the cost of resistance. So he turned, his movements deliberate, his dignity intact even as they took it from him piece by piece. The metal of the cuffs was cold against his skin, a physical reminder of the systemic failure that had brought him to this moment. The officers led him to the back of a patrol car, their grip firm but not harsh, as if they believed their restraint was a kindness. The crowd watched, their silence a testament to the powerlessness they felt, or perhaps their complicity. One person raised a phone, recording the scene, but no one stepped forward. The man sat in the back of the patrol car, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He could feel the eyes of the officers on him, could hear their murmured conversations filled with coded language that carried no ambiguity. As the car began to pull away, the man glanced at the house he had been parked in front of. It was his house. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. The scene was a symphony of injustice, each note played with deliberate precision to remind him of his place, or rather, where they believed his place should be. But what none of them knew, not the officers, not the crowd, not even the neighbor still peering out from behind her curtains, was that this man was no ordinary citizen. He was the judge assigned to oversee police misconduct cases in the very city these officers served. And this was far from over. What happens when those who abuse their power are forced to answer to the very system they tried to manipulate? Stay with us to uncover the twist that left an entire community stunned. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. To every black viewer watching this, we support your strength, resilience, and fight for justice. Your stories matter, your voice matters, and your existence matters. Let's continue to push for a world where fairness and equality prevail. Now, get ready for an emotional and gripping story that will leave you inspired and hopeful. If you enjoy the narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join us in amplifying powerful stories like this. Enjoy the journey. The morning sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of the affluent suburban neighborhood. The neatly trimmed lawns and pristine sidewalks seemed to tell a story of peace and order, but beneath the surface, there were cracks in this perfect facade. One of the homes, a modern two-story house with tall windows and an elegant front porch, belonged to Marcus Bennett, a man who had worked tirelessly to achieve everything he had. Marcus was a well-respected judge, known not only for his sharp intellect but also for his unwavering commitment to fairness and justice. At 42 years old, his life was a testament to perseverance and discipline. Born in a modest neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, Marcus's path hadn't been an easy one. He had grown up in a single-parent household, with his mother juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet. From an early age, Marcus learned the value of hard work, often spending his evenings studying under the dim light of a shared lamp while his siblings played outside. His mother, a strong and resilient woman, always reminded him that education was his way out, his weapon against a world that didn't always welcome him with open arms. Her words stayed with him. Marcus excelled academically, earning scholarships that took him from public school classrooms to the prestigious halls of Harvard Law. But his achievements didn't shield him from the discrimination and microaggressions that seemed to follow him at every turn. From professors who underestimated his abilities to colleagues who questioned his qualifications, Marcus had become adept at navigating a world that was quick to judge him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. Despite the challenges, Marcus thrived. He became a skilled attorney, earning a reputation for his eloquence and meticulous attention to detail. Over time, his career led him to the bench, where he was determined to ensure that justice wasn't just a lofty ideal but a tangible reality for those who needed it most. Marcus took pride in his work, often going above and beyond to mentor young attorneys and law students from underrepresented backgrounds. To many, he was a symbol of hope and perseverance. But while Marcus's professional life was defined by his success, his personal life was marked by solitude. His demanding career left little time for relationships, and though he had close friends and a loving family, there was an unspoken distance that came with the weight of his responsibilities. The home he lived in, with its minimalist decor and pristine organization, reflected the discipline and control he applied to every aspect of his life. This particular morning, Marcus was preparing for an important day. He had a high-profile case involving police misconduct on his docket, and he knew the trial would draw significant public attention. The irony wasn't lost on him: holding law enforcement accountable in a system designed to protect them often felt like an uphill battle. But Marcus believed in the power of the law, even when it seemed to falter. As he sipped his coffee, reviewing his notes at the kitchen counter, he felt a sense of resolve. The world might not always be fair, but within his courtroom, he would ensure that fairness prevailed. He glanced at the clock and realized he needed to leave soon. Grabbing his briefcase and keys, Marcus stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeting him as he walked toward his car, a sleek black sedan he had purchased as a quiet reward for years of hard work. Across town, Officer Richard Daniels was starting his shift. At 38, Richard was a seasoned officer, known among his peers for his no-nonsense attitude and sharp instincts. But Richard's career was also marked by a history of complaints, most of which were quietly dismissed by a system that favored loyalty over accountability. His interactions with certain communities had often been tense, with accusations of racial profiling and excessive force trailing behind him. To Richard, he was simply doing his job, keeping the streets safe, even if that meant making quick judgments about people and situations. Richard wasn't a man prone to introspection. He saw the world in black and white, and his authority as an officer gave him a sense of control he didn't have in other aspects of his life. His marriage was on shaky ground, strained by years of long hours and unspoken resentments. His wife had grown tired of his temper and his refusal to change, and his teenage son barely spoke to him. But Richard buried those frustrations under his badge, channeling his emotions into the one area of his life where he felt respected. That morning, as Richard patrolled the quiet suburban streets, he noticed a black sedan parked along the curb of an upscale neighborhood. The car's tinted windows and sleek design caught his attention. Richard slowed his patrol car, his gaze narrowing as he tried to make sense of the situation. To him, the car seemed out of place, an anomaly in an otherwise predictable environment. He pulled over, stepping out of his patrol car with the authority of someone who believed they were always in the right. Approaching the driver's side window, Richard's eyes scanned the vehicle, taking in every detail. When the window rolled down, revealing Marcus behind the wheel, something in Richard's demeanor shifted. He didn't see a judge or a man who had earned his place in this neighborhood. He saw a threat, a challenge to the order he believed he was protecting. The interaction that followed was tense, a collision of two lives shaped by vastly different experiences. For Marcus, the encounter was a reminder of every barrier he had fought to overcome, every moment he had been made to feel like he didn't belong. For Richard, it was a reinforcement of the biases he carried, the assumptions that shaped how he viewed the world and the people in it. As Marcus stood on the curb, watching Richard search his car with a determination that bordered on obsession, he felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, humiliation. But beneath it all, there was a quiet resolve, a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. He knew this moment would not define him, but it would leave a mark, a scar that would fuel the decisions he made in the days to come. Meanwhile, Richard's actions were fueled by an unspoken need to assert his authority, to prove that his instincts were right, even when they weren't. But in his haste to judge, he failed to see the larger picture, the consequences of his actions that would soon unravel in ways he could never have anticipated. What began as a routine traffic stop was about to become a turning point, not just for Marcus and Richard, but for everyone watching from the sidelines. As the scene unfolded, the line between justice and prejudice blurred, setting the stage for a confrontation that would challenge everything they believed about power, accountability, and what it truly means to belong. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the pristine streets, as the story of Marcus and Richard began to unfold. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the small, sterile room where Marcus sat, his hands resting on the cold metal table in front of him. The tightness of the handcuffs around his wrists was a dull ache, but it paled in comparison to the humiliation that pulsed through his veins. He sat tall, his composure betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Across from him, Officer Daniels leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. The room reeked of control, of authority unearned but loudly declared. "Got anything you want to tell me?" Daniels said, breaking the silence, his voice dripping with condescension. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching, his jaw tightening as he measured his words carefully. I already told you everything. My name is Marcus Bennett, and I live in this neighborhood. Check your system if you're so convinced I don't belong here. Daniels chuckled, the sound low and grating, as if the very idea of Marcus asserting himself was a joke. Sure you do. Funny how your kind always has a story ready. He pushed off the doorframe and moved closer, his shadow stretching across the table like a predator closing in on its prey. You know, it's always the ones who act calm who have the most to hide. Marcus felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down, steadying his breath. Losing his temper here wouldn't help. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Hours had passed since the initial stop, and yet they were still here, going through this same cycle of baseless accusations. Run the plates, Marcus said evenly. You'll see they match the registration in my name. Then we can end this. Daniels ignored the suggestion, instead circling the table slowly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't exist. You talk real smooth, he said, his voice taking on an edge. Almost like you're used to talking your way out of trouble. Maybe a lawyer? Or you just watch a lot of courtroom dramas? Marcus let out a quiet sigh, his patience fraying at the edges. You're wasting time, officer. My record is clean, and you'll find nothing to justify holding me here. Daniels paused behind Marcus, the tension in the room thickening. Clean, he repeated, his tone mocking. You think just because you've got a suit and a fancy car, you're better than me? That you're untouchable? The words hung in the air, and Marcus realized that this wasn't just about him, it was about Daniels, about his insecurities and the power he felt slipping through his fingers. Before Marcus could respond, the door creaked open, and a younger officer stepped in, a tablet in hand. Sir, he said, hesitating as he glanced between Marcus and Daniels. I ran the plates and checked the ID. Everything checks out. He's telling the truth. Daniels stiffened, the authority in his posture faltering for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a scowl. Run it again, he barked. The younger officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but nodded and left the room. Marcus watched the exchange, noting the cracks in Daniels's confidence. He decided to press, his voice calm but firm. You're not going to find anything, Officer Daniels. And when this is over, you'll have to answer for why you detained me without cause. Daniels slammed a hand on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. Don't lecture me, he snapped, his voice rising. You don't get to play the victim here. I've seen people like you, always acting like the world's out to get you when you're the ones breaking the rules. Marcus's gaze hardened, the calm exterior giving way to a quiet fury. People like me, he said, his voice low but filled with an intensity that made Daniels pause. Do you even hear yourself? Or are you so blinded by your biases that you can't see the man sitting in front of you? I've worked harder and accomplished more than you could imagine, and yet here we are, because you can't accept the possibility that I deserve to be here just as much as you do. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door opened again, and the younger officer returned, looking uneasy. Sir, he said, addressing Daniels. It's confirmed. His address, his car registration, his employment, he's clean. The room fell silent, the weight of the truth pressing down like a heavy fog. Daniels's jaw tightened, his mind scrambling for a way to regain control of the situation. But before he could speak, Marcus leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension. You've made a mistake, he said, his tone steady but unyielding. A mistake that won't go unnoticed. Daniels glared at him, his chest rising and falling as anger and fear warred within him. We'll see about that, he muttered, but his bravado rang hollow. He turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Marcus alone with the younger officer. The younger man hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice quiet. I'm sorry, sir. For what it's worth. Marcus studied him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. It's not worth much, he replied, though there was no malice in his tone. The officer nodded, a flicker of shame crossing his face before he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. As Marcus sat there, the adrenaline from the confrontation began to fade, replaced by a deep exhaustion. But beneath the weariness, there was a spark, a determination to see this through, to ensure that this wasn't just another incident swept under the rug. He didn't know yet how far he would go, but he knew this: Daniels would face the consequences of his actions, and Marcus would make sure of it. Outside the room, Daniels paced the hallway, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that the man he had detained wasn't someone who would simply let this slide. And for the first time in years, a flicker of doubt crept into his thoughts, a nagging voice whispering that he might have underestimated his target. As the day stretched on, the tension between Marcus and Daniels simmered like a pot on the verge of boiling over, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither of them could have anticipated. The courtroom was filled with a tense, almost suffocating silence, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers and the occasional cough. The polished oak benches gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the murmurs of anticipation rippled through the crowd like an undercurrent, everyone waiting for the session to begin. Marcus sat at the judge's bench, the black robe resting on his shoulders like armor. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet intensity. Today was different. This wasn't just another case. It was personal. Across the room, Officer Daniels sat at the defendant's table, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed like it might snap. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but Daniels barely reacted, his gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look in Marcus's direction. The weight of the past few weeks bore down on him. The revelations, the backlash, the humiliation, it had all come crashing down in a way he hadn't anticipated. For years, Daniels had moved through his job with a sense of untouchable authority, but now, every decision, every action, was under scrutiny. And the man sitting on the bench was the reason why. The clerk called the courtroom to order, and the proceedings began. Marcus's voice carried through the room, steady and commanding, as he outlined the charges against Daniels. Unlawful detention. Abuse of power. Racial profiling. The words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. As the prosecution presented its case, evidence after evidence painted a damning picture of Daniels's behavior. Body camera footage. Witness testimonies. A trail of complaints that had been ignored or buried. Marcus listened intently, his expression unreadable, but inside, he felt the weight of every story, every injustice that had been allowed to persist. When it was time for the defense to speak, Daniels's lawyer stood, his voice measured but strained. He tried to frame Daniels as a dedicated officer, someone who had made an error in judgment but had acted in the interest of public safety. It was a familiar argument, one Marcus had heard too many times before. But this time, it felt hollow, the words falling flat against the mountain of evidence. Daniels finally took the stand, his hands gripping the edge of the podium like it was the only thing keeping him steady. His voice was low, hesitant, as he answered the prosecutor's questions. He admitted to stopping Marcus that day, admitted to searching his car, admitted to detaining him. But when asked why, his answers grew defensive, laced with justifications that crumbled under the prosecutor's relentless questioning. "I was doing my job," Daniels said, his voice rising slightly, a hint of desperation creeping in. "I thought he might be a threat." "A threat," the prosecutor repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "What about Mr. Bennett made you think he was a threat? Was it his car? His skin color? The fact that he was sitting in a neighborhood you didn't think he belonged in?" Daniels flinched, his face flushing as the prosecutor's words hit their mark. He glanced at Marcus, but the judge's expression didn't waver. I don't know," Daniels stammered. "It wasn't about race. It was a feeling." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed. "A feeling. So you detained a man, humiliated him, and violated his rights because of a feeling. Is that correct, Officer Daniels?" Daniels shifted in his seat, his shoulders hunching as he struggled to find an answer. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the tension thick enough to choke on. Marcus raised his hand, silencing the crowd, and leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on Daniels. "Officer Daniels," he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority. "Do you understand the implications of what you've done? Do you comprehend the harm caused by acting on a feeling rather than evidence, rather than justice?" Daniels looked at Marcus, and for the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I made a mistake," he said quietly, the words almost lost in the stillness of the room. "A mistake," Marcus repeated, his tone even but sharp. "A mistake is spilling coffee on your shirt. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. A choice rooted in bias and a failure to uphold the very principles you swore to protect. Do you deny that?" Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, and Marcus let it stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. Finally, Daniels lowered his head, his hands gripping the edge of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white. "No," he said, barely above a whisper. "I don't deny it." The room seemed to exhale all at once, the tension breaking like a dam. Marcus straightened, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "Justice is not about revenge. It is not about punishment for punishment's sake. It is about accountability, about ensuring that the power entrusted to individuals is wielded responsibly and without prejudice. Today, we have seen what happens when that trust is broken. And we must decide, as a society, whether we will tolerate it or demand better." The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. As the gavel fell, the sound echoed through the room, a final punctuation to the story that had brought them all here. Daniels slumped in his seat, the weight of the decision settling over him like a shroud. Marcus stood, removing his robe as the court began to disperse. He glanced at Daniels one last time, not with anger, but with a quiet resolve. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and crisp, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the steps. Marcus paused, taking a deep breath as reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing. He didn't answer, his focus elsewhere. This wasn't the end, it was a step forward, a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of resistance. He walked away, his head held high, ready to continue the fight for justice, knowing that the road ahead would be long but worth every step. As the courtroom emptied, Marcus remained seated behind the bench, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. The gavel's final strike still echoed in his mind, not as a triumph but as a reminder of the long road that had brought him here. His gaze lingered on the now vacant defense table where Daniels had sat just minutes ago, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his conviction. Marcus took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. This moment, this confrontation, wasn't just about Daniels. It was about everything Marcus had fought against his entire life, and for the first time, it felt like the tide was turning. In the hallway, Daniels stood alone by the water fountain, his lawyer having left after a few curt words. His head hung low, and his hands fidgeted with a loose thread on his sleeve. The courtroom doors creaked open, and Marcus stepped out, his presence commanding even without the black robe. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither man spoke. The air between them was charged with a mixture of anger, regret, and something neither of them could fully name. Daniels was the first to break the silence. "So, this is how it ends, huh?" His voice was flat, stripped of the arrogance that had marked their previous interactions. "Me, the villain. You, the hero. That's what you wanted, isn't it?" Marcus's expression didn't change, but his voice was calm, measured. "This was never about making you a villain, Daniels. It was about accountability. Something you seemed to forget when you stopped me that day." Daniels let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Accountability. That's a nice word for tearing someone's life apart. You don't know what it's like to have everything you've worked for crumble in a single moment." Marcus's gaze hardened, his voice rising slightly, though still controlled. You think I don't know what that feels like? I've spent my entire life navigating a system designed to make me fail, a system that judges me before I even open my mouth. And yet, here I am. Because I didn't let that system break me. But you. You had power. You had privilege. And instead of using it responsibly, you let it corrupt you. Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You think you're so much better than me. But you don't know me. You don't know what I've been through, what I've had to do to survive in this job. Marcus stepped closer, his voice steady but laced with intensity. You're right. I don't know your life. But I do know this, surviving doesn't give you the right to strip someone else of their dignity. You chose to see me as less than human that day, and now you're paying the price for that choice. Daniels opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, the words dying on his tongue. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the polished floor as if searching for answers he couldn't find. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice quieter, almost vulnerable. Do you think I'm a monster? The question caught Marcus off guard, but he didn't let it show. He studied Daniels for a moment, his expression softening slightly. I think you're a man who let fear and prejudice dictate his actions. But being a monster? That's a choice. And it's up to you whether or not you continue down that path. Daniels looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's. There was no defiance left, only a raw, unguarded uncertainty. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Marcus sighed, the weight of the moment settling over them both. You start by owning your mistakes. Not just to me, but to every person you've wronged. And then you do the work. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's the only way forward. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hallway around them was quiet, the bustle of the courthouse seeming a world away. Finally, Daniels nodded, though his expression remained conflicted. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. Not from you, not from anyone. But maybe I can do better. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He watched Daniels, searching for sincerity in his words. That's not for me to decide, Marcus said finally. It's up to you to prove it. Daniels nodded again, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Marcus watched him go, his thoughts racing. He didn't feel satisfaction, only a cautious hope that perhaps, in the face of accountability, change was possible. But he knew better than to rely on hope alone. Change required action, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths that people like Daniels often avoided. As Marcus stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, he was met with a throng of reporters, their cameras flashing, their voices blending into a cacophony of questions. He raised a hand, signaling for quiet, and the crowd stilled, waiting for his response. Marcus took a deep breath, his words deliberate and clear. Today was not about revenge. It was about justice. Justice for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong, like their rights don't matter. This is just the beginning. There is more work to be done, and I intend to see it through. The reporters pressed for more, but Marcus didn't linger. He walked down the courthouse steps, his pace steady, his mind already turning to the next steps. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of possibility, a sense that change was within reach. And he was ready to face whatever came next. The courtroom's verdict had been delivered, the weight of justice falling squarely on Officer Daniels. But the ripple effects of that moment extended far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Outside, the story dominated the headlines, stirring debates that echoed across dinner tables, offices, and social media feeds. Marcus Bennett had become a reluctant symbol of accountability, his face plastered across news segments and op-eds, some hailing him as a hero while others questioned his motives. Yet, for Marcus, the outcome wasn't about public opinion. It was about what came next. In the days following the trial, Marcus returned to his routines, but the normalcy he sought felt out of reach. His quiet home, usually a refuge, seemed to echo with the events of the past weeks. The moments replayed in his mind with a vivid clarity: Danielle's defiance, his eventual collapse, the raw vulnerability in his voice when he admitted he didn't know how to fix what he'd done. Marcus couldn't shake the memory of that final exchange in the hallway. It wasn't pity he'd felt for Daniels, but a realization that even in accountability, the journey toward redemption was fraught with uncertainty. At the same time, Marcus found himself inundated with messages. Some were words of gratitude from people who saw themselves in his story, who felt vindicated by his courage. Others were harsher, accusing him of exploiting the system to settle a personal vendetta. But it was one letter, handwritten and anonymous, that stood out. It simply read, "Thank you for standing up, but what about the others?" Marcus stared at those words for a long time, the question weighing heavily on him. He knew what it meant. Daniels wasn't the only one. The system that had protected him for so long still existed, and Marcus couldn't ignore the responsibility he felt to address it. Meanwhile, Daniel's world had shrunk to the confines of his modest home. The once confident officer now faced a future that felt uncertain at best and bleak at worst. The department had placed him on unpaid leave pending further investigation, and the whispers from his neighbors and former colleagues were impossible to ignore. He rarely left the house, avoiding the judgmental stares and the pointed silence that greeted him wherever he went. His wife had moved out temporarily, taking their son with her. Daniels didn't blame her. He hadn't been the husband or father they deserved for a long time, and now, the consequences of his actions were undeniable. Sitting alone at his kitchen table, Daniels found himself scrolling through news articles about his trial. The comments were brutal, a mix of outrage and schadenfreude that painted him as a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. For the first time, Daniels felt the sting of being on the other side of judgment, of having his entire life reduced to a single narrative. He hated it, but he couldn't deny its truth. The man he saw reflected in those articles wasn't someone he recognized anymore. And that terrified him. One evening, Daniels decided to do something he hadn't done in years: he wrote a letter. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but an attempt to put his thoughts into words, to make sense of the chaos inside him. He addressed it to Marcus, though he wasn't sure he'd ever send it. In the letter, he admitted to his fear, his ignorance, and the ways he'd let those things control him. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. When he finished, he folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, unsure if it would ever see the light of day. For Marcus, the aftermath of the trial brought new challenges. He had always been a private person, content to do his work quietly and without fanfare. But now, his name carried weight, and with it came expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. Invitations to speak at events poured in, along with requests to join panels and advocacy groups. Marcus found himself torn. He had dedicated his life to the law, to upholding justice within the confines of the courtroom. But the world outside those walls was calling, urging him to take his fight to a broader stage. One afternoon, Marcus met with an old friend, a civil rights activist named Elaine who had spent decades fighting for systemic reform. Over coffee, she challenged him in a way few people dared to. "You've done something remarkable, Marcus," she said, her voice steady but insistent. "But one trial doesn't change the system. You know that as well as I do. What are you going to do about it?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, her words sinking in. He respected Elaine, admired her tireless dedication, but he wasn't sure he was ready to take on the mantle she seemed to be offering. "I'm a judge, Elaine," he said finally. "My role is to interpret the law, not rewrite it." Elaine shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Don't sell yourself short. You're more than a judge, Marcus. You're a symbol now, whether you like it or not. People are looking to you for leadership. And the question is, are you going to rise to the occasion or let it pass you by?" The conversation stayed with Marcus long after they parted ways. That night, he sat in his study, staring at the stacks of case files on his desk. His work had always been his sanctuary, a place where logic and reason prevailed. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that his responsibilities extended beyond these walls. The anonymous letter, Elaine's challenge, the stories of those who had reached out to him, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. He couldn't stay silent. Not anymore. The following week, Marcus made a decision. He called a press conference, his first since the trial, and stood before a sea of cameras and microphones. His speech was measured, deliberate, but filled with a quiet passion that resonated with everyone listening. He spoke about the need for accountability, for systemic change, and for a commitment to justice that went beyond individual cases. This isn't just about one officer or one trial, he said. It's about creating a system that serves everyone, equally and without bias. And it's about each of us doing our part to make that a reality. As the conference ended, Marcus felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in weeks. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was ready to take the next step, whatever that might look like. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond himself. For Daniels, the days continued to blur together, but something shifted after he received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from Marcus, as he'd half expected, but from a local organization that worked with officers struggling to rebuild their lives after misconduct. The letter was an invitation, not a condemnation, and it offered Daniels something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. It was a small step, but as he read the letter, Daniels realized it was a step he was ready to take. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faint stirrings of a path forward. One that might, eventually, lead to redemption. Marcus sat alone in his chambers, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. In front of him was a stack of letters, each one filled with stories of injustice, pleas for guidance, and words of gratitude from people who had seen themselves in his struggle. The weight of it all was overwhelming, but it was a reminder of why he had chosen this path. He picked up a letter near the top of the pile, the handwriting uneven and hurried. It was from a mother whose teenage son had been stopped and humiliated by police in their own neighborhood. She wrote about her anger, her helplessness, and the fear that one day her son might not come home. Marcus read the letter twice, the words cutting deep. He felt the familiar pang of frustration, the urge to do more, to be more. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Elaine stepped inside, her presence a steadying force. She had a way of showing up exactly when Marcus needed her most, even when he hadn't realized it. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, closing the door behind her. "You've been avoiding my calls." Marcus leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I've been busy," he said, gesturing to the mountain of correspondence on his desk. "Seems like everyone has something to say these days." Elaine crossed her arms, leaning against the edge of the desk. "And what are you saying back?" Her tone was direct, challenging, but there was a softness in her eyes that made it clear she wasn't here to criticize. "You've got a platform now, Marcus. People are listening. What are you going to do with that?" Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have all the answers, Elaine. I'm a judge, not an activist. My job is to uphold the law, not rewrite it." Elaine tilted her head, a hint of amusement in her smile. "You keep saying that like it's an excuse. But you and I both know the law isn't perfect. If it were, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You've already proven you're willing to challenge the system. So why stop now?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He turned his chair to face the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "I'm not stopping," he said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm just trying to figure out how to move forward without losing who I am in the process." Elaine nodded, her expression softening. "That's fair. But don't let fear hold you back. You have something rare, Marcus, integrity. Use it." As she left, Marcus sat in a quiet room, her words echoing in his mind. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the choices he had made, and the ones he had yet to make. He knew Elaine was right. This wasn't the time to hold back. It was the time to push forward, to be the change he had spent his life fighting for. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel sat in the dimly lit room of a community center, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The air was thick with tension, the hum of the fluorescent lights barely audible over the murmur of voices around him. It was his first meeting at the officer rehabilitation program, and he wasn't sure why he had come. Part of him felt like it was a waste of time, a performative gesture that wouldn't change anything. But another part of him, quieter but persistent, had whispered that he needed this. That maybe, just maybe, it was a step towards something better. The facilitator, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, began the session by inviting everyone to share why they were there. Daniels listened as the other officers spoke, their stories a mix of regret, anger, and defensiveness. When it was his turn, he hesitated, his throat tightening as he tried to find the words. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've made mistakes. Big ones. And now I'm just trying to figure out if I can fix them." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Then the facilitator nodded, his voice steady and reassuring. "Acknowledging the mistakes is the first step. But fixing them? That takes work. And it's not just about what you say, it's about what you do." Daniels nodded slowly, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. The session continued, the stories and conversations weaving a tapestry of struggle and redemption. By the end of the night, Daniels felt something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. The days that followed were a blur of reflection and small steps forward. For Marcus, it meant diving deeper into the letters and stories that had flooded his desk, finding ways to use his platform to advocate for change. He began hosting forums, inviting community leaders, law enforcement officials, and everyday citizens to have honest, difficult conversations about race, power, and accountability. The forums were tense at times, but they were also necessary. Marcus believed that change couldn't happen without understanding, and understanding couldn't happen without dialogue. For Daniels, the journey was more personal. He continued attending the rehabilitation program, each session peeling back another layer of the walls he had built around himself. He started volunteering at a local youth center, working with kids who had grown up with a mistrust of the police. It wasn't easy, some of the kids refused to speak to him, their skepticism etched into their faces. But Daniels didn't give up. He listened, he learned, and slowly, he began to see the world through their eyes. One evening, as Daniels was leaving the community center, he noticed a familiar figure waiting by his car. It was Marcus, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Daniels approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "Judge Bennett," he said, his voice tinged with both surprise and apprehension. "What are you doing here?" Marcus studied him for a moment before speaking. "I heard you've been coming here," he said, his tone measured. "I wanted to see for myself." Daniels shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "And? What do you think?" Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "I think it's a start," he said simply. "But it's not enough." Daniels nodded, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not looking for a free pass, if that's what you think. I want to be better." Marcus considered him for a long moment before replying. "Then keep showing up. Keep listening. And maybe, one day, you'll get there." As Marcus walked away, Daniel stood alone in the parking lot, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he had a path, a difficult, uncertain path, but a path nonetheless. The city buzzed with an uneasy energy as the fallout from the trial continued to ripple through the community. Marcus had grown accustomed to the spotlight, but it was a burden he bore with caution. He sat in his office late one evening, the room dimly lit, the hum of the city audible through the window. He was reviewing notes for an upcoming forum when his assistant knocked softly on the door and stepped in, holding a plain envelope. "This came for you," she said, her voice hesitant. "It's from Officer Daniels." Marcus stared at the envelope for a moment, his fingers resting on its edges. He thanked her, then waited until she left before opening it. Inside was a neatly folded letter, the handwriting precise but hesitant. Marcus read the words carefully, each sentence drawing him deeper into the mind of the man he had judged. Daniels had written about his journey since the trial, the lessons he was learning, and the steps he was taking to rebuild. The letter wasn't a plea for forgiveness, nor did it shy away from his failings. Instead, it was an acknowledgement of his flaws and an attempt to take responsibility. The final line struck a chord in Marcus: "I don't expect redemption, but I hope to earn back a fraction of the trust I've lost." Marcus folded the letter and placed it on his desk, his mind heavy with thoughts. He had seen countless defendants express regret in his courtroom, but this felt different. It wasn't performative or calculated, it was raw and unfiltered. For the first time, Marcus wondered if there was a chance for Daniels to truly change, and whether he had a role to play in that transformation. The following week, Marcus found himself at the community center where Daniels had been volunteering. He didn't announce his visit, arriving unaccompanied and without fanfare. The hum of activity greeted him as he stepped inside. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, mingling with the sounds of basketballs bouncing on the gym floor. Marcus scanned the room until he spotted Daniels in a corner, kneeling next to a group of kids as they worked on a mural. Daniels's demeanor was different, softer, less guarded. He listened intently as one of the children explained their vision for the mural, nodding and offering encouragement. It was a far cry from the man Marcus had faced in the courtroom. Marcus approached slowly, his presence drawing curious glances from the kids. Daniels looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He stood, brushing his hands on his jeans, his expression a mix of unease and anticipation. "Judge Bennett," he said, his voice cautious. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "I came to see for myself," he said simply. "Your letter got me thinking. I wanted to understand what this place means to you." Daniels glanced at the kids, who had resumed painting, their focus shifting back to their work. "This place," he paused, searching for the right words. "It's not about me. It's about them. These kids, they've been through so much already. They don't trust easily. I'm just trying to be someone they can rely on, even if it's only for a little while." Marcus studied him, his expression thoughtful. "And do you think you're succeeding?" Daniels hesitated, his shoulders lifting in a slight shrug. "I don't know. Some days, it feels like I'm making progress. Other days, I wonder if I'm just fooling myself. But I keep showing up, because that's the least I can do." There was a sincerity in Daniels's voice that caught Marcus off guard. He nodded slowly, his tone measured. "Showing up is a start. But it's not the end. Trust isn't something you earn overnight. It's built piece by piece, moment by moment. And it's fragile." Daniels met his gaze, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. "I know. I've broken more trust than I can count. But I want to be better. Not just for them, but for myself. I don't want to be the man I was." Marcus considered this, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "Words are important," he said finally. "But actions matter more. Keep showing up. Keep listening. And don't let the setbacks define you." Daniels nodded, his expression solemn. "I won't," he said quietly. "I owe it to them. And to myself." Over the next several weeks, Marcus and Daniels's paths crossed more frequently, their conversations growing less formal and more candid. They discussed systemic issues, personal accountability, and the complexities of redemption. Marcus found himself surprised by how much he valued these discussions. Daniels, for all his flaws, was making an effort to confront the biases and mistakes that had shaped his actions. It wasn't an easy process, and Marcus didn't let him off the hook, challenging him whenever his words hinted at defensiveness or deflection. But he also offered guidance, drawing on his own experiences to help Daniels navigate the path forward. One evening, after a particularly heated forum on police reform, Marcus found Daniels waiting for him outside. The night was cool, the city alive with its usual energy. Daniels looked nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "About trust, about rebuilding. And I realized something. I've never really apologized. Not fully. Not to you." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his arms crossing as he leaned against a nearby railing. "And what would an apology mean to you?" he asked, his tone even. Daniels hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It means owning what I did. Not just the day I stopped you, but all the times before that when I let my biases dictate my actions. It means acknowledging that I caused harm, not just to you, but to everyone I've treated unfairly. And it means committing to doing better, even when it's hard." Marcus studied him, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "An apology is a start. But it's not enough. What matters is what you do next. The choices you make every day, the way you treat the people who cross your path. That's how you make amends." Daniels nodded, his expression serious. "I understand. And I'm ready to do the work." For the first time, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Daniels, but for the possibility of change on a larger scale. He extended a hand, and after a brief moment of hesitation, Daniels shook it. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward something neither of them had thought possible just months ago. Months had passed since the trial, and the city seemed to breathe differently. The tension that had once felt suffocating now gave way to cautious optimism. Marcus had become a quiet force for change, not through grand gestures, but by doing what he did best, listening, leading, and holding people accountable. His forums had grown into a movement, bringing together voices from all corners of the community. Conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening in packed rooms, with people sharing stories that demanded to be heard. Marcus was at the center of it all, a steady presence that others gravitated toward. One evening, as Marcus walked into a forum held in a crowded community center, he was greeted by a standing ovation. The applause was deafening, a recognition of the work he had done and the courage he had shown. Marcus held up his hands, signaling for quiet, and the room settled. He spoke with his characteristic calm, his words carrying the weight of someone who had lived the very struggles he sought to address. He reminded them that change was not a destination but a journey, one that required persistence and accountability from everyone involved. When the forum ended, people lined up to shake his hand, their gratitude evident in their words and expressions. Marcus felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not because of the praise, but because he could see the seeds of progress beginning to take root. Across town, Daniels sat at a different kind of gathering. The youth center where he volunteered had organized a celebration for the kids who had completed a mural that now adorned the building's exterior. It was a vibrant, chaotic scene, with laughter and music filling the air. Daniels stood on the sidelines, watching as the kids he had mentored basked in their accomplishment. One of them, a boy named Jaden, ran up to him holding a small paintbrush. "We saved this for you," Jaden said, his voice full of excitement. "You have to sign it." Daniels hesitated, the request catching him off guard. He looked at the mural, a sprawling masterpiece that told the story of resilience and hope, and felt a lump rise in his throat. "You sure you want me to?" he asked, his voice quiet. Jaden nodded emphatically, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the wall. Daniels knelt down and added his name to the corner of the mural, his hand shaking slightly as he did. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Later that night, Daniels found himself at his kitchen table, staring at the letter he had written to Marcus months earlier. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing again. This time, it wasn't about regret or self-reflection, it was about gratitude. He wrote about the kids at the center, the lessons they had taught him, and the hope he had found in their resilience. He wrote about the work he was doing to confront his biases and the ways he was trying to rebuild trust, both with others and with himself. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, addressing it to Marcus. It felt like closure, but also a beginning. For Marcus, the next chapter of his life brought new opportunities and challenges. He was approached by a group of community leaders who wanted him to run for office, to take his fight for justice to a broader platform. Marcus hesitated at first, wary of stepping away from the courtroom where he had built his career. But after long conversations with Elaine and others he trusted, he realized that this was the logical next step. He announced his candidacy with a speech that was both humble and powerful, focusing not on promises but on the principles that had guided him throughout his life. The response was overwhelming, and Marcus found himself stepping into a role he had never anticipated but was uniquely prepared for. On the night of his campaign launch, Marcus stood on a stage in front of a packed auditorium, his voice steady as he spoke about the work still to be done. He glanced at the crowd, his eyes landing on familiar faces, Elaine, his mother, colleagues, and even Daniels, who had come to show his quiet support. As Marcus finished his speech, the room erupted in applause, a wave of energy that felt like a promise of change. For Daniels, the journey was far from over, but it was one he was no longer afraid to face. He continued his work at the youth center, eventually becoming a mentor to new volunteers who wanted to make a difference. His relationship with his wife and son remained a work in progress, but there were moments of connection that gave him hope. One afternoon, his son joined him at the center, helping paint a new mural. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The final chapter of their intertwined stories wasn't about redemption or closure, but about the possibility of change. Marcus and Daniels had taken different paths, but both had arrived at a place where they could see a future shaped by accountability, compassion, and the determination to do better. Their stories were a reminder that while justice might be imperfect, the pursuit of it could bring out the best in people when they were willing to confront their flaws and fight for what was right. As we reflect on this story, we're reminded of the power of accountability, the importance of listening, and the courage it takes to change. Marcus and Danielle's journeys show us that while justice isn't always immediate or perfect, it is possible when people are willing to do the hard work of facing their mistakes and committing to growth. What do you think about their paths? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where accountability led to change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, inspired you, or gave you something to think about, please consider subscribing to our channel, Tales of Twist. We're dedicated to bringing you stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the complexities of the human experience. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next twist.